So we've been talking a lot with reporters today and how they approach the work of covering the Pentagon and how they build and establish relationships. We've talked about a little bit of that with Louis this morning and with Helene this afternoon. And now we're going to talk about the other side. Because as journalists, the best that we can expect are relationships that are based on respect and mutual trust. And for years, George Little was the face of the two most demanding assignments in Washington, I think. Even though I come from a Justice Department perspective, I was always dumbfounded by the folks who cover the Pentagon and the CIA. But George was the face of both of those institutions, ultimately serving 3 defense secretaries. His terms coincided with the deadly raid on Osama bin Laden's Pakistani hideout and the wind down of the long war in Iraq. George's respect for the mission has always resonated with me. He was here for the 2024 class, and I thought that his message was particularly relevant now, and he was kind enough to accept an invitation to return. And one of the things I wanted to repeat from his last appearance here was quoting from his departure from government several years ago. I won't say how many years ago.
It's been a few minutes.
But he quoted Thomas Jefferson with this: "The only security of all is in a free press. The force of public opinion cannot be resisted when permitted freely to be expressed. The agitation it produces must be submitted to. It is necessary to keep the waters pure." And I think we can't be reminded enough of that message. And it was good to come from somebody who deals with reporters every day, as George did. So please welcome George Little.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Kevin. I should say at the outset that you are led here by one of the most respected journalists in a very long time. Kevin has had a storied career and is a terrific mentor and leader in the profession, and it's very hard to say no to an invitation from him. So I'm really honored to be here with you, Kevin, and with all of you. All right, sounds good. I'm happy to. I have a son in college, so I need the help. It's great to be here, and we can really take this in any direction you all would like to go. I'm happy to kind of open up with a little bit about my background. I won't dwell on that too much. Talk a little bit about my perspective on how government spokespeople like I was engage with, interact with the press, give you my perspective on what right looks like in those relationships, and answer any questions you have about life in Washington and engaging with the government. There's obviously a lot to talk about these days. I know you were at my former professional home, the Pentagon, earlier today. I hope that was an interesting visit. Lots of change going on there at the moment. And happy to give you my perspective on what's happening in that building or elsewhere. Does that sound like a good
sounds like the
roster of
way to
agenda
go.
items? Okay, fantastic, good. By the way, I only have 2 hours of remarks, so and then we'll open it up to questions, and then you can get to the bar, where I hope you will be enjoying one of those company very soon. No. In all seriousness, let me just briefly kind of describe my background. I grew up in this area in Loudoun County. I'm really a creature of Washington. I went to the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, thus my affinity for Thomas Jefferson. Then ended up going to UVA, Thomas Jefferson again, and then went to Georgetown for my PhD. I really thought I was going to live the good life as a college professor on a Leafy College campus somewhere, and ended up not doing that. Thought it was a little bit too solitary in existence for me. And I went to work for IBM and then Booz Allen doing corporate strategy and national security consulting for several years. My first government assignment was actually at the National Counterterrorism Center, which had been my client. And they asked me to come on board to do some things I couldn't legally do as a contractor. I really enjoyed that assignment. And while I was there, the CIA called me up. Mike Hayden was the director and said, "George, we want you to be our spokesman." And I said, do you have the right George Little? There aren't too many of us, but I've never talked to a reporter in my life. And do you know how candid I can be? I'm not sure that's what the CIA really wants, is someone like that. I went home that night and said to my wife, Bethany, you'll never believe this, but the CIA wants me to be their spokesman. And she said, are they crazy? And anyway, I decided to take a flyer and ended up doing that role and really enjoyed it. And spent 4.5 years there. And then spent 2.5 years at the Pentagon. I really thought I was going to leave the CIA on a stretcher or in handcuffs. That's usually how it ends there. But my boss at the time, director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, became Secretary of Defense. And in a conference room with lots of people, he directed me. I really had no choice to go with him to the Pentagon. That's classic Leon Panetta. I spent 2.5 years at the Pentagon as press secretary for his tenure there, as well as the first year or so of Secretary Chuck Hagel's tenure. After 7 years in senior government roles, thereabouts, I decided that I needed to go see my small children again and return to the private sector. What Kevin quoted from Jefferson, and thank you very much for reminding me of my departure note back in the day, I really do believe that. Even in times of great change and dynamism and even turmoil, I think that one of the most precious things we have about American society is the press. And I thought that when I was in government, even during the tough times and the tough moments with reporters, if we don't have this as a staple of our democracy, then I don't know what we really have. Obviously, we could talk about the various changes that have taken place in the media landscape and in relationships between the government and media. So I'm happy to give you my perspective, and I'll share at least how I went about being a government spokesperson for the agency and for the Pentagon. The first thing I think that I always remembered about my role as government spokesperson was that it wasn't just about talking points. That's important. You need to make statements and so forth. But it's also to engage and educate reporters and to inform, because there is, I think, a responsibility on the part of government spokespeople to ensure that your stories are as accurate as they can possibly be. I spent much of my time as CIA spokesman and at the Pentagon just sitting down and walking through the issues with reporters, talking about Afghanistan or Iraq in the day, or nuclear proliferation, or the defense budget, or what have you. Not necessarily to pitch a story or anything like that, but just to help shape the conversation and shape the story and help inform it. I knew I wasn't always going to be on the right side of the story, but my general approach was to engage. So engagement, education, trust building, and making sure that you are as responsive as possible to members of the press. When you're a spokesperson, that's your job, in my opinion, right? It's sometimes seen as an adversarial role, and obviously at the podium sometimes that happens, and we see that especially with this administration these days. But at the end of the day, both sides need each other. And I recognize that really the only thing I had as a spokesperson wasn't really the force of government, to be honest with you. I mean, I had information and so forth, which is important, but it was really my reputation, my personal reputation. If I was going to be successful in the role, I had to be believed by reporters, had to be trusted, and that takes a little bit of time to build. I had to engage with reporters, not just when they called in a transactional way on a story, but to go out and actually get to know them a little bit, what makes them tick, what they're interested in, what parts of the Pentagon they want to cover, or what issues at CIA they're most interested in. And so it's a much more art than science, I think, kind of approach that good government spokespeople, in my opinion, take. There were several of us at a reunion of former national security spokespeople last week at the Army-Navy Club, and we talked about the current state of affairs and what's happening. And these were Republican and Democratic administration people. This was not a political event, and we all, I think, had the same approach. We all said, look, even in these massive times of change, even with the new administration, which has at times been quite adversarial toward the press, there's a through line here, and this will persist. And people in our roles, people in government public affairs positions are going to continue to play a critical role in informing stories, in developing relationships with the press. Yes, when necessary, in defending their bosses and their buildings and so forth. But everyone I saw there gave me some hope, some currently serving actually, that we're going to get through whatever period we're currently in. In terms of kind of day-to-day tactics that I would use, and I don't mean that in the pejorative sense of the term tactic, but I would respond to any press query, period, from any outlet. I don't think you should feel, I mean, I realize that there are certain outlets that, are top tier, some are trades and so forth and so on, but be persistent. Make sure that you get an answer, because government public affairs offices should be responsive, even if it's a no comment at the end of the day, right? And sometimes I had to say no comment, but get an answer. Number two, ask the public affairs officials, in whatever department or agency you're covering, to go out for coffee. Get to know them a little bit. It doesn't need to be a long, involved conversation, but face-to-face still matters in the age of digital media and AI. Nothing can replace that. Some of the best reporters at the Pentagon, who you saw today, including Louis Martinez, who I think helped shepherd you around. Louis is great in part, along with others at the Pentagon, because they walk around the building. They don't just email. They don't just text. All of those things are important, but face-to-face still matters in this day and age. Make the effort to Uber out to wherever you need to go, or to have a quick coffee with someone, or to pick up the phone. Frankly, those were the relationships that I was invested in most at the Pentagon and at CIA. Not that I was going to make friends with everyone, because that's not the nature of the relationship, but it's about building that trust. And that engagement, smart engagement, matters. Both sides have to be careful, protect their equities, protect their respective roles, protect their ethical, and in the case of my obligations, legal and ethical. Didn't want to go to jail for disclosing classified information. I could do that, but had to be authorized, or use my judgment sometimes. Anyway, no, I don't want to confess any of that today. But there is a remarkable amount that can get done, and that investment of time at the outset will pay off, in my view. Whether you're covering the Hill or the administration, take the time to go have coffee. And there's no better time to do it than transitions like this. I mean, there's so much change and turbulence and so forth that I would prioritize that. That sounds very basic, but I did see, especially at the Pentagon, the reporters who sat in the bullpen, great reporters, who stayed in the bullpen and just emailed across the building, I think were a little less effective sometimes than those who were walking around and being a little bit more 3D about the way they pursued their craft. In the intelligence community, I mentioned before that some people think that no comment is a standard line of CIA. In fact, there used to be a button at CIA Public Affairs that had comment with a red line through it. We made a conscious decision, actually, when I was there, to be much more active, to be on the record, and to be even aggressive at times with educating members of the public and the press, and with being more on the record. And we decided we had to do that in part because at the time, CIA was in the spotlight, and a lot of skeptics out there, been through some challenging times, and there is no natural political constituency for the agency. There's no, the agency has no bases. I mean, they do, but can't really talk about them. No military bases, no, aircraft to point to, no shiny things. It's an interesting mission that is fodder for movies and for other things and captures the imagination of many. But when it comes to political constituencies, it's a little dicey. Republicans and Democrats over the years have both pointed their fingers at the CIA. So we decided that we had to speak for ourselves and had to be out there a lot more. Well, again, not to be out there in a reckless way, but certainly to not engage in what had been the no comment phase of CIA public affairs. And I think that paid off in some cases. Maybe not in all, but I think we were relatively successful in building some decent relationships over time with national security reporters who are very seasoned in many cases, who have been around the block, who know how to separate the wheat from the chaff, know when you're BSing them, And it was really important for us to build that trust, again, even when we were being criticized or there was a scandal of some sort or an issue really we had to deal with. In my time there, I dealt with, Kevin mentioned the bin Laden raid. Happy to talk through that in a few minutes and how that unfolded from a communication standpoint and from a press engagement standpoint. There were a lot of issues that didn't quite end in the same way. They were much more difficult to work through. I was there during the tail end of the enhanced interrogation program, where there was a lot of controversy around CIA interrogation techniques, a lot of criticism from Congress and from civil society groups and so forth. So that was, one of the things that we had to deal with. There was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan as well, and nuclear proliferation was really on the rise when I was there. Pentagon. The interesting thing about the Pentagon is it's not just about guns and wars and tanks and airplanes. As I used to tell Chuck Hagel, my boss at the time, there are about 3 million people who work for this building and for you. 2.2 million service members, active duty guard reserve, and then about 700,000 or 800,000 civilians. I said, that's twice the size of your home state of Nebraska, which has roughly 1.5 or 1.7, something like that. And, he would always shake his head at me. And then I said, look, this is not just about running military operations. It's about running a school system, a justice system, commissaries, massive physical installations around the world. And you really are the governor of a state that has a lot of weaponry. I mean, think about that responsibility. There are a lot of, the healthcare system within DOD is huge. So the Pentagon press corps can cover so many things, including national security issues that are top of mind, Israel, Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, but they can also cover healthcare benefits for the force, the readiness of the force, what's happening in DOD schools. So you can spend literally a lifetime covering that building, which is what some people have done and have done amazingly well. I will say that the National Security Press Corps, and I consider Kevin part of it, even though he was mainly at Justice, but covered a lot of national security issues. What a seasoned group of people. These are people who know their stuff. When they don't know something, they want to know something. They're learners. And if you show that eagerness as a reporter, I think, to understand and to get it right, then you will build that trust with government spokespeople. There will be adversarial moments, okay? You'll come up on a story and the government spokesperson won't like it. But in the main, keep that engagement going, maintain your professionalism. Hopefully they do too. I try not to get angry too often. Didn't always get it right, but generally in the main, I didn't lose my temper. If you maintain that and think that this is a sport of a long season, as opposed to a transaction for this story, then I think your career in Washington, or more broadly as a reporter, I think will benefit. Is this helping? Okay, all right. So make sure I'm not totally making people snooze at 3:45 in the afternoon on a Friday. Where shall I take this? I think, maybe it's just, maybe some questions will be prompted by the bin Laden story. Maybe we'll go there? Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things I thought fascinating is the communications strategy that you all build around that. And maybe you could start there and then take it wherever it goes.
On the bin Laden operation?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, it's late 2010 or early 2011. I'm in the CIA leadership meeting, which happened daily or every couple of days. I kept hearing things about this compound and, slight references to it and whispers and so forth. And eventually I came to realize that this was something important. And a couple of weeks later, I was pulled in and briefed on this compound in this city called Abbottabad, Pakistan, that we thought might have an interesting person residing there. And after I came to, after I got through my smelling salts, I recognized that obviously this was going to be a big deal, and went back to my office. And later that day, I went back to Director Panetta at the time, had a meeting with him on something else, and I said, oh, by the way, on the compound thing, look, I know this may or may not happen. Intel trail may go cold. We may decide not to do it for whatever reason. But if we go for this, then this is going to be a big deal. And we have to have a plan in place. And whether it goes right or wrong, we need to be prepared for success or failure. And we need to do this in a way that's going to protect the equities of the CIA, the administration, the president at the time. We're going to have to justify this. And we're going to have to tell this story, whether it goes right or goes wrong. And so we need a communications plan. This will make headlines. And he said, you got it. Okay, go for it, George. The CIA lawyers said, well, you can't really plan a public affairs communications, thing, strategy for a covert operation technically. But I said, come on, So anyway, got clearance from them, and I, along with a very small group of people, one to start with, one other person, and then one or two other people at the end, built a communications plan for the Bin Laden operation. 66 pages at the end of the day, 33 pages for success, 33 pages for failure. Success meaning we capture or kill Bin Laden. It is Bin Laden, number one. Remember, it was a circumstantial case up until the very end. And failure meaning the operation went wrong. We didn't reach the compound. Helicopters or airplanes or however we were going to execute the mission wasn't going to where they would crash, and one kind of did on the compound that night. Or it wasn't him. It was another tall guy walking around the compound and we misidentified him. So they were saying, well, what about this? I said, I can't plan for every possible failure scenario, but failure is failure at the end of the day. It's not him. Luckily, we never got to that point. But for both scenarios, success and failure, we prepared what would become the unclassified intelligence case, what led us to believe that this was bin Laden in an al-Qaeda compound. A draft statement by the president that would be issued, Q's and A's and so forth that could be used as background material and briefings for the press, and internal messages to the workforce and so forth and so on. Kind of your classic communications package. We worked closely with the operators, attended meetings so that we knew what the latest and greatest intelligence was, so that we were staying up to speed on it, because this was a fast-moving train. And we worked closely with elements of the U.S. military as well, who were deployed in a very secret room at CIA headquarters to make sure that we had that aspect of things right too, because this was truly a joint operation. It was a Title 50 operation, so it was technically by law, commanded, if you will, by my boss, the director, but this was really executed by brave men and women on the ground who led an incredibly precise mission in Pakistan, launched from what were then our bases in Afghanistan. So it took us several weeks. It was really never done because we were still dusting it off up until the very last moment. But that consumed a number of weeks. Had to explain to my wife why I was not at home as much as I should have. So I won't talk about the state of my marriage at that time, but we're still married and have a good relationship. But it was pretty tense period. And then of course, as we got closer, there were some interesting things that happened. We were pretty sure this was going to happen. We get closer and closer. 3 days before the planned day of the raid, my boss, Leon Panetta, is nominated to become Secretary of Defense. And my first reaction was, they're nominating you 3 days before this raid, which could go right or it could go really wrong. And do you know that we all might be resigning in a few days? Luckily, that never happened. He got confirmed. The raid went well. But that added some complexity and stress to an already challenging time. And then the weekend before the raid, there were very few people read in outside the CIA and a very small group of people in the military in the White House. I think 7 or 8 people until the very last weekend were read in at the White House, and that includes the president and vice president, national security advisor, and a few others. So I went down on Saturday morning before the raid, which happened on a Sunday night, to brief the Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, and we met Saturday morning. I drove myself with a lock bag with classified information. Basically everything in the Bin Laden raid was in that bag. I parked on G Street near the White House, walked over to the Secret Service booth in Lafayette Square, went up and said, "I'm George Little from CIA, and here's my numbers and whatever. Sorry, sir, you're not in the system." I said, "Are you freaking kidding me? I really have important information here. I need to go." It took him 45 minutes to clear me. I'm pretty unflappable generally in situations like that, but I'm standing there in Lafayette Park with everything to do with the Bin Laden raid clutched here, concerned that someone would mug me, and that I would be the reason and the sole reason why Bin Laden would take another 10 years to find. But I ended up getting cleared through, and now you'll know why I have a lot of gray hair and a lot less of it. It was really because of that Saturday. Anyway, went through that day. Maybe you'll recall that night was the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and my boss and I were being hosted by the Wall Street Journal. And I told various national security leaders that they had to go. That evening they couldn't stay away. They had to, pretend like this was all business as usual and so forth. I did have one very national senior official come to me and say, "George, I'm just too tired. I don't want to go." And I said, "You are going to get your posterior," I used a different word, to the Hilton tonight where it's typically held, and you're going to make it through at least the main course, and then you can leave it at dessert, but you got to go. We don't want people suspecting something. And my boss was there, and of course I was really concerned that someone would spill the beans that night because we were all pretty tired and stressed out, and things were about to happen. Anyway, we got through that, and President Obama at the time, was speaking, as many presidents do at this dinner, not always the current one. And Seth Meyers, who was the comedian that night, made a lot of jokes about Bin Laden. And so we were all politely laughing there, trying to get through that. And luckily we did. The next morning, went back to the agency where I stayed throughout the day. And around 1:15, I walked into the director's office or conference room, and he was there. And it was turned into a makeshift kind of operations center with video conferences to Afghanistan and communications to the White House and so forth and so on. And he's kind of bantering with Bill McRaven, who was this commander of Special Operations Command and had led the raid, military side of the raid. And they were talking rather casually, actually, back and forth to one another. Remember, Bill was drinking a huge Diet Coke. And suddenly, Panetta, my boss, just turns really formal. I'm standing there going, "Well, I don't know what the hell's happening." And he just takes out some words on a piece of, and he says, "Upon the orders of the President of the United States, Bill, I direct you to begin this operation." So I said to my staff member who was with me, "This is getting real." So take down the time here. I think it's important. And then a number of us walked into that room. A little later, we monitored the operation. It was unfolding. It was fairly tense, as you would imagine, but quiet. And that was the first time, really, I learned the power of Twitter, to be honest with you, because people were live tweeting from rooftops during the raid. And that was something new for me at the time and kind of surprised us. I think we expected it to be a less densely populated area than it really was. So you heard that kind of input from people around the room. We were tracking what was happening on screens. We were communicating a little bit with the White House along the way. And at one point we heard Geronimo EKIA. When we all turned to each other, we said, "I don't know what Geronimo EKIA is." And we heard a little bit later, Geronimo KIA. And Geronimo, I guess, was the military term or code name for Bin Laden. And KIA means killed in action. So we knew at that point that that he had been killed in the raid. And then we really didn't feel like this was over until our aircraft returned to Afghanistan. So it wasn't really until about 90 minutes later that we felt like, okay, we can breathe a sigh of relief. And we tracked that very closely, hoping that everyone would get out safely, and they did. I can't tell you how superior the military operators were. They just did an incredible job, including, even though they took out the Al-Qaeda members of the group at the compound, the women and children were all whisked away safely and unharmed, and that's great credit to them. In any case, there was no high-fiving. It was really more quiet hugs around, a sense of accomplishment, maybe a little bit of relief that the mission had, actually happened. It was successful. Then I went down to the White House that night, and everyone was trying to figure out how to. It's not just about the press, right? It's important, don't get me wrong, you all are important people, but it's also about your allies and partners and how to inform them. And the stakes were high here, especially with Pakistan, because we had undertaken a unilateral operation on their soil without their knowledge. And so that was the first call that the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff made to his counterpart. And that series of communications began. People started communicating with Congress. Once that started happening, I knew that this thing was about to blow open. There was a lot of speculation that night on television. Is this Gaddafi? Is it something else? Why is the president, coming out to speak? In fact, the president didn't want to speak that night. He wanted to wait until Monday morning because it was Sunday night. And I said, this thing ain't going to hold. We need to go tonight. This is big news. And people know that we've taken bin Laden out. So that's why he went out so late, but that was just how the timing worked out. And then after he did his speech, we did some background briefings for reporters at the White House, and then we went back to the agency. And as we were leaving, and this was not for us because there was a construction wall at the White House at the time, but the crowd had started to gather out front, and they were chanting CIA, CIA, CIA. And I turned to my boss and I said, "Sir, I don't know whether to be happy or to run." Because when large crowds are chanting CIA, that's not usually a good thing. The pitchforks are coming anyway. But there were a lot of lessons learned actually from that. I think that while the operation obviously was a mission success, I think that we could have done a little bit better in the aftermath, trying to control the amount of information that went out, confirmed information that went out. It was a feeding frenzy, as you would expect, and there were lots of people speaking around the Beltway who probably didn't have the information at hand to be speaking as authoritatively as they should have. But so that was a little bit hard to navigate. But one of our main concerns was to establish the legitimacy of the operation for the American people. That wasn't necessarily hard to do, but we had to convince them that this was right and done legally and so forth. Number two, we had to kind of convince the enemy that it was bin Laden, and not allow them to spin some story that we had not actually gotten them. So we had to think about that aspect of things. And we also had to think about, not wrecking our relationships with reporters by sharing information that was going to turn out to be bogus. And there were some bits and pieces out there that, not from me, but from others, that turned out to be bogus and that shouldn't have gotten out there. I think that in retrospect, we probably should have spent more time as a government confirming certain details with the team on the ground in Abbottabad just to make sure that we had the sequence of operations correct. There were crazy stories about night vision goggles and body cameras and seeing bin Laden up close, and that never happened. And so there was a lot of bogus out there that I think could have been handled a little bit differently. One of the big debates post-raid was whether or not to share the photos of bin Laden, the death photos. And frankly, I was part of a group of people who said, I think we probably should. This looks like him. This will serve as clear evidence that it was bin Laden. There will be no doubt in most people's minds. And this will disabuse anybody of the notion that he's still walking around. Admittedly, fairly gory photos, but still, identifiable as bin Laden. And the president and other senior advisors, I think, ultimately made the right call at the end of the day. They said, no, we don't want that to get out there. We don't want to look like we're, really touting this, even though there is some benefit maybe in confirming his identity through this visual proof. And so I said, well, are there other ways that we can do this, without releasing the photo? And it turns out that we actually were able to locate a lot of really helpful information at the compound itself, collected a lot of material there that demonstrated that this was really bin Laden in an al-Qaeda compound. So a week after the raid or so, briefed reporters at the Pentagon briefing room on background and showed the visuals. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't, but they were really outtakes of bin Laden, watching videos of bin Laden, or practicing for video messages and so forth. So once people saw those images and those videos, then it was pretty clear to most people. So we didn't have to end up releasing the photos, death photos anyway, at the end of the day. Let me pause there.
I'll just jump in. How close was it in terms of reporters' knowledge or whatever knowledge they had
Yeah.
to undermine the operation? I mean, was it ever a close call, and how did you deal with that?
So I was convinced that as the circle grew in Washington, the people who knew about this raid, that there might be a call from one of you saying, I've heard something big is going to happen in Pakistan, and I heard that this is a big guy, and this is going to be an important news story. I really did worry about that up until the very end. I remember talking actually the day of with people on my staff about how we would handle this if something like that happened. I was also pretty confident that if it were, a New York Times reporter or, someone I was engaged with on a regular basis, that we could probably make a deal, frankly. I mean, I think that any outlet that had printed information at that time that would have timed out the raid before it happened, I think that would not have been favorably viewed by the American people. And I was pretty sure that we could reach an agreement. Now, I would have had to make a deal and promise exclusives and so forth and so on, and probably sit the reporter down with the operators or with the intelligence officers who I worked with in CIA to give them some background and context on the raid. But I was pretty sure that responsible journalists would not. And we actually never got close. In fact, I work now with a former Wall Street Journal reporter named Siobhan Gorman. She was my host with Panetta that night, and she to this day is still really angry with me for not having given her a little bit of a tip that something was going to happen the next day.
Hi there. So I'm Shrey with PBS NewsHour. I wanted to ask a little bit about...
Say hi to Lisa.
I will do. I will do.
She and I went to high school together. Don't tell me.
Oh, gosh. Well, yeah, great. I definitely will.
All right.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, obviously, this new administration, and particularly throughout the confirmation hearings, particularly with Pete Hegseth, we had a lot of questions about the recruitment efforts of the military and how that's something that he is both concerned and focused on, as are a number of members of Congress. And I kind of want to ask you about how the executive orders and attitudes now within the Department of Defense could hamper or help that recruitment effort. And if you think that this current Secretary of Defense and what's happening from the White House is actually going to impede that moving forward.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. I am... Look, I think we all, my perspective is the following. We all, as Americans in this country, want a fighting force and a military that represents us. Yes, that can absolutely fight and win, but that also creates opportunity for all Americans. And I actually believe that both sides of the aisle, including the Trump administration, are not opposed to diversity and inclusion. I think it's the E where a lot of the disagreement is. Now, DEI programs and how structurally the government is set up to implement some of these ideals and so forth, we can have a discussion about that. But I actually think intellectually, even though it hasn't necessarily played out politically because there have been divides, I think we're closer than we may think in some ways. I'm not necessarily justifying what's happened at DOD. We were the administration that opened combat roles to women. And I think that remains an important objective, and I think we should continue to do that. On recruitment, which is already a little bit tough, it was not going the right way for DOD prior to this administration. I think that there will be some Americans, some groups that think maybe this is not for me. And I'm not sure that's healthy. We want to have people involved in various aspects of the military or around the military mission. It's not all about fighting and spider crawling, and training exercises. So I'm concerned that there will be a suppressive effect on recruitment efforts. I think we can have diversity. think we can have equity. I think we can have inclusion, and I think we can have warfighting Americans and lethality, to use a current term of choice, all at once. It's not an either or.
Hi, thanks for doing this. Audrey Decker with Defense One.
Oh, yes. I remember when Defense One was founded.
Yes, right, Kevin.
Kevin, I know Kevin very well.
Yes.
2013, as I recall.
Yes.
Yeah. Chuck Hagel was your first keynote speaker. You're welcome.
I'm curious, as a spokesperson, whether, at DOD or CIA, how, if the DOD or CIA did something that you personally just didn't agree with, how you kind of put that aside, I guess, to, outwardly at least defend or justify that, and kind of like how you wrestle with that personally.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Audrey. I think the short answer is I was never forced to say something that I didn't really want to. I was never challenged morally, with one set of exceptions, I will say. I wasn't necessarily a big fan of a lot of the enhanced interrogation program. Do I think waterboarding is the right way to go? Probably not. But what I cared about at CIA was CIA officers who were instructed that this program was safe, lawful, and effective by policymakers and by others, and it had been briefed to Congress. So this wasn't the CIA doing some kind of rogue thing out there. And a lot of these officers came under a real microscope and suffered a great deal doing what they thought they had approval and legal authority to do. So for me, in those instances where I might have had a slight disagreement with policy, and when you're in the intelligence community, you're not a policy-making agency, you're an intelligence agency. I think I really thought about my colleagues and how they were grappling with this and how they were facing scrutiny for something that both the Article 1 and 2 branches of government knew about.
Let's go up here, and then we'll make our way.
Hi, thank you for doing this. My
course.
name's Hannah Devassay. I work at ABC News and I cover the White House.
Great.
My question for
Nothing
you.
going on there.
Yeah.
This week has been a long year.
Yeah. My question for you is, as a former spokesperson, I'm curious just your take and your thoughts on, kind of see this at the White House. Curious if this falls through at the State Department or the Pentagon. This talk about new media, letting in podcasters and social media influencers into the briefing rooms. I'm just curious your take on it and just how you view it, like this shift in the media landscape and just expanding.
Yeah, I think my take is that we have to shift with the times, and frankly, I think it's okay for new media to have access, whether that's at State or the Pentagon or the White House. A lot's happened at the Pentagon recently, a lot in the headlines over the Pentagon briefing room and certain media outlets being switched out. I wouldn't have done that, but it is what it is. It is a government building, and there's not much the media can do, frankly. Tell me if I'm wrong, Audrey. But I know this is something that the Pentagon Press Association is all over right now. But where I think we are at fault in the government is that there's a lot more space for media. We could open more space at the Pentagon, I probably should have done that when I was there, but we didn't. And so I'm okay with new media coming in, responsible new media and so forth. There's always a bit of a chop line, but I think we need to also not exclude others because of physical space these days. So look, I don't necessarily disagree in principle with what the White House has done. I do disagree, with how the Pentagon is handling it, because in a building with 25,000 people, you can make room for a few more people.
Yeah, go up there.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Pravina. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, just a little news outlet. You talked about adversarial moments. So I was wondering, as someone who's on the other side, like engaging with reporters, what you've seen as best practices from reporters that helps retain trust through those adversarial moments that you're talking about.
Yeah, so look, I think look, we all make mistakes. I wasn't always 100% right. Heart was in the right place, but I didn't always get the information I was sharing right. So I think um, it's like in anything, right? Acknowledging when there's an issue, right? And not ignoring it, addressing it in a timely manner, just like you would address an issue with your family member or friends or roommates or what have you. These things, unlike fine wine, don't get better with age. They tend to age like milk. So trying to nip it in the bud early, I think, is really important, number one. Number two, I actually found myself most angry, and this wasn't very often, but when embargoes were broken. That drives me absolutely bonkers. And I remember having a very heated discussion at the Intrepid Museum in New York at a dinner because we were traveling there, the press was there, and one outlet, I won't name the outlet, broke an embargo, and of course all the other reporters were lighting me up, and they had every right to do so, and I was upset. And so that really stings as a public affairs officer when the ground rules are broken, when embargoes are broken, because that tends to break trust. And then in response, it makes it worse if you say, well, it was my editors. You own the story. It may have been an issue in New York or wherever, but it's your story. So I would just acknowledge that and be human about it.
Thanks for speaking with us.
Of course.
My name's Sophie. I'm with the Christian Science Monitor. So I think this is probably increasingly true as news organizations are kind of like less staffed and news stories feel like they're growing in number. But and at the Monitor, like, we're smaller staff, but we try to cover a lot of ground. So often I'll find myself writing on a topic where I don't have a regular byline.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, like, as a spokesperson, what a reporter could show you when they're not someone whose like face you would see daily in the halls or whose byline you would necessarily see every day covering like arms deals or whatever.
Right.
If they then come to you and it's like, hey, I'm a religion reporter, but I'm actually writing today about this like arms deal.
Yeah.
Like what could a reporter show you to demonstrate like credibility if it's not like a beat based credibility?
Right. It's a great question, and increasingly, one that a lot of reporters are dealing. I mean, a lot of reporters don't tend to cover just one building anymore, right? I mean, the Pentagon is different, White House is different, but and that's changed. Reporters used to cover a building. You were the DHS beat, or you were, DOJ has a beat still, but a lot of agencies and departments don't. So there are a couple of approaches there. One is to get others to vouch for you in media, right? Your colleagues at CSM, if they have, or frankly others in the beat who's, hey, you should get to know so and so, or former spokespeople who can vouch for you. I mean, that's not a requirement, but it can help. So I think it's, and it doesn't take long, right? If you get a little bit of validation, from a third party, that could be helpful. Kevin, would you agree?
I would, and especially I think what's been lost in last 10 even more years is the handoff that used to occur traditionally. If you were moving on from a beat, there used to be a time when you were mentored by the person on that beat and were kind of plugged into at least their contacts, their network, and so you were given a running start. As you all know, that doesn't happen so much anymore, and often you're thrown into the water completely cold. And but I think George is absolutely right. You have to find creative ways around that, and even if and mostly reaching out personally in person to the people that you're trying to make contact with. I just find the texting, email route just, I'm so over that. And I think the pandemic created an atmosphere, enabled that atmosphere to sort of spread and become acceptable. And I think that has to be, unwound. in a lot of ways. But yeah.
Hi, I'm Sibel. I cover the Pentagon for USA Today.
Oh, okay, all right, great. I'm in trouble today.
This is my lucky day. So I wanted to ask you about kind of the legacy of like the war on terror. And I feel like, in the last few years, we have seen this sort of like fragile situation in many of the countries where the U.S. was involved just sort of unravel in very disastrous ways. And I would say, tell me if I'm wrong, but I also feel like as well, sort of the public trust in the intelligence community is like at an all-time low. And so I'm just wondering, as somebody who kind of saw that from the inside and was privy to some of the decisions that were made, it's like, what do you think went wrong with that? What mistakes were made?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think to your first point on the counterterrorism legacy of the last 25 years or so, I think that number one, we learned about our own government and our own shortcomings at the time, right? Information sharing, how the government was constructed, firewalls inside the government, and so forth and so on. I think that we were shooting a little bit from the hip, literally, at the outset. We didn't know how to necessarily deal with this new threat that took us by surprise in New York and at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania on 9/11. So there was a lot of improvising, I think, at the outset. And that worked out pretty well, frankly, in Afghanistan. We were able to get in there fairly quickly, and so, I mean, at the outset. I think we did put Al-Qaeda on its back feet for a very long time. I will say there hasn't been a major foreign attack on U.S. soil really in a long time. I mean, a terrorist attack. Yes, there have been moments, and there have been attacks, but massive 9/11 style attacks really haven't happened. So there has been some success in going after counterterrorism targets. But you're absolutely right. We have seen not just Al-Qaeda, but ISIS. And I try to get people to talk about what was then called the Nigerian Taliban, but turned out to be Boko Haram in Nigeria and in Mali and elsewhere. So there has been, clearly a radicalized terrorist movement that has cropped up over the last couple of decades. How much of that is the United States responsible for? I think we probably did make some mistakes, frankly, in the way we articulated policy and executed it. Could we have been a little bit more surgical in Afghanistan? Maybe. Let's have the conversation about Iraq as well. Was that the right war to fight, and did that have a natural flow and consequence, on radicalization and ISIS and so forth? We talked, then there's the Arab Spring and all of the fallout from that. So I'm willing to concede that there were mistakes made. I think there were successes on the part of the U.S. government too, and protecting the homeland was number one, and I think we get a fairly decent grade there. Okay. I think there were also other forces that were in play, the rise of social media, social movements that were well beyond the scope of U.S. policy as well. There were issues within particular countries, including in North Africa, that I think contributed to the Arab Spring and some of its aftermath. So yes, I think U.S. policy probably did, have some role to play. Could we have made some decisions a little bit differently? Yes. In the main, are we safer because of what the U.S. government did post 9/11? I think the answer is also yes. And I think that's a tribute to millions of people, who have served in uniform and in civilian clothing in my former agency and others in the intelligence community to make happen. I do think that there is a crisis of institutional legitimacy writ large, right? It's not just about DOD and CIA and others. I think that for whatever reason, the American people have lost a lot of trust in government. In fact, in 2015, I gave a talk at Georgetown that said, I think people really don't want to go into public service anymore. It's just not the cool place to be. And that was deeply concerning to me, whether it's Department of Labor or CIA or wherever. We should want good people, smart people to go into government. And we can talk about all the reasons why, the pay gap between private sector and public sector and so forth and so on. But there is something that's an undercurrent across all institutions. DOD and CIA are natural lightning rods, I think, just given what they do and what they're called upon. The easy problems don't come to the CIA. So I think there's going to be controversy that attaches, and you're never going to bat 1,000. That doesn't mean I excuse the strikes, and bad hits at the plate, but I do think you have to put it in that context. That was a wandering answer, but hopefully, sorry.
Right back here. And then we'll go.
Hi, my name is Katie Stanton. I'm a Capitol Hill reporter for Tax Notes, which you may guess is a pretty small outlet. So
a lot going on, busy beat these days.
Yes, yes, this year. But I wanted to ask, you were talking a lot about like kind of the best practices and what makes like a good, press person and PIO.
Right.
But as a small outlet, I definitely run into people who aren't like that. They kind of see it as very transactional.
Yeah.
What is publishing or giving you a comment for your outlet going to serve, for me on Capitol Hill, like my member or what have you.
Right.
And that can be, pretty challenging. Sometimes I'm sending 10 emails across weeks and maybe getting one back. So I guess from like a reporter standpoint, knowing that, I'm at a small outlet and I may not be able to offer the same amplification, like
Right.
how should I go about those relationships? Obviously you talked about the interpersonal aspect, which,
Yeah.
I attempt to do, but there is a level of like transaction there and I've
Fair
definitely faced
enough.
some challenges.
Yeah. And volume is high on the Hill and so forth. Yeah. Look, my personal mindset, although not everyone follows this, but I always thought, well, you might be at this outlet today, but you might be somewhere else tomorrow, right? And you have to think about that, and not just about the relationship in the moment. So I would try to be responsive, whether it was a big outlet with lots of circulation, or frankly with a blog, which was fairly new at the time I was in government. So that was my personal perspective, but I realize others have a more transactional view on it. I think you just have to keep chipping away at it, and frankly, play offices off each other. Use those interpersonal skills to, frankly, gain a little bit of leverage. Do it in the right way, professional way, friendly way. But you have more leverage, I think, than you think, even if it takes a little bit of time to get a quote back or a response.
Excuse me.
Hi, I'm Lee. I'm with CQ Roll Call. I'm kind of curious, you talked a little bit about being worried that things would leak and like people breaking embargoes. I'm kind of wondering like what your process was when you felt like you weren't treated fairly by a news outlet. I'm guessing the person who broke the embargo like wasn't getting an exclusive the next day. So just kind of curious like what your response was typically to those instances.
Yeah, it was mainly a tough conversation, to be honest with you. It wasn't me like pulling badges and, because I knew it was a sport of a long season, right? And that I would still need that relationship over time. But would I think twice about including that person in the next Pentagon press trip to wherever with the secretary? Maybe, So I would say that this didn't happen that often. I mean, the Pentagon press corps has always been exceptionally professional, but there are mistakes that happen. So it would be frosty for a while sometimes, but we would usually get through it. And I knew that I had to make sure that I wasn't seen as engaging in retribution, because that wasn't going to serve me, the Pentagon, the CIA, or my bosses very well at the end of the day. But it is problematic, but again, you have to treat this as a long game.
Hi, Mia McCarthy. I'm a Capitol Hill reporter at Politico. I wanted to ask, so all of us are younger reporters.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've dealt with a lot of reporters, both seasoned
I feel like I'm in my peer group here.
and you've probably dealt with a lot of younger reporters. So from you being on the other side, I guess, what's something that young reporters you find either get wrong or are still, or that's something that they should know earlier on, I guess, either generally or about the Pentagon?
About the Pentagon? Yeah. So are you also at the Pentagon? Yeah.
No,
Okay.
but I'm just curious.
Yeah. So, look, I do think, I mean, to be honest with you, younger reporters, I think need to be a little bit more prepared when they engage. You need to come with a point of view or to be informed. And if you're informed and educated, and you come with, a perspective or a tip that you feel is pretty strong, then that will get you a long way. I think. I mean, any reporter, but especially if you're younger. Like if you come prepared, it's like being prepared for your job interview, right? Or a meeting with your boss. If you're prepared, that goes a long way and will, I think, yield over time a much better relationship. If you play the young card, it doesn't always work. I'm new, and can you help me out? I think be confident, own it. You're smart people. You know how to do research. You know how to be informed. I mean, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't seek information or be educated by the government spokesperson on the other side of the phone or the desk. But, just if you're informed, prepared, and confident, that'll take you a long way.
So, in the interim, I wanted to ask, knowing you're not in government anymore, but I don't think any of us saw a proposal to for buyouts at the CIA or anywhere else, and what's happening at FBI and Justice in terms of forced resignations and the like. Sitting where you are now, and with the experience of having been in government, in national security, how vulnerable does that make us at the moment?
Look, I think it's a huge problem. I think that people in my former buildings are feeling shocked. Morale is, I think, probably low. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? There's a lot of worry about respect for their mission overall. I do worry about the long-term effects of taking a wrecking ball to the federal workforce in this kind of manner. Look, I would agree that there's probably efficiency in the federal government. Who wouldn't, that we can achieve? There's greater efficiency. We probably should have some reductions elsewhere. But is this a planful way to go about it? Is this very strategic? No. And if you're in the intelligence community or DOD, that's one thing you prize. You understand rationally driven decisions and actions. This doesn't feel particularly rational. And so I think that's contributing to a lot of fear, uncertainty, and worry. And does it have national security implications? Potentially. When you have highly specialized people who have been doing their craft, whether it's on the operational side or on the analytics side for a long time, and they're one of very few people in the world who knows something about that, and they decide to leave, the consequences are obvious. So I understand that the politics of this, the administration has a point of view on how to roll this out, but I think it's been done in a way that has been unstrategic and potentially very harmful and cruel in some cases.
One last shot. Anybody? Okay.
Thanks for being here, Skylar Woodhouse with Bloomberg News. I'm on the White House team. Piggybacking off of what was asked on like being a younger reporter, just like generally speaking, if this is like the very first, coffee you're having with someone who presents as being very young, like, I mean, I was in 6th, 7th grade when the Bin Laden raid took place. But, what really ticks you off in terms of questions, or you're like, oh my gosh, I'm wasting my time with this person? Like, what are some of those things that like we can all avoid?
Yeah, I think it gets a little bit back to what I said earlier. I think that, if you come in and you're like, just give me something, George. I'm new, and because I'm new, I deserve something. No, be a little hungry. Be a little informed, come with a potential story idea, right? Come with a little bit of sizzle in the way you express yourself. Be confident. And even though you are young and you may present young, you don't need to necessarily play to that. You're a professional. You're an adult. You're smart. You work for a major publication. So own it. And if you demonstrate that, then I think you get a lot of respect earlier on. from government spokespeople would be my advice.
Well, with that, I hate to close it down, but
You all are probably happy.
no, but please thank George for the time.
Thank you.
And the information.